Is it water with the sheep in the box?
Hello there, I'm off for the Christmas period, so I thought I'd just make this bonus video for you since I have nothing better to do and I spend all my time online as it is. As you may or may not be aware, I'm the guy who made a feature-length breakdown of the politics of Harry Potter and the implications this might have for the personal politics of its author, culminating in what I would deem to be pretty damning evidence, pointing towards J.K. Rowling being a TERF, that's trans-exclusionary radical feminist in case you weren't aware. In layman's terms, just someone who uses the language and aesthetics of women's liberation in order to oppress trans people, because unfortunately there are some people who acknowledge that society is in many ways anti-woman, but who then decide to, rather than show solidarity with all women, instead use what little privilege they have to shit on and oppress those they deem below them on the ladder. Oh, and also they use the classic right-wing tactic of deliberately ignoring science in order to be a dick to marginalised people. And then about a week later she went full mask off TERF, which on the one hand was pretty vindicating and made me look like a prophetic genius, Nostradamus in the box over here, but on the other, is rather sad that we have pretty definitive confirmation that one of the most influential figures of the last decade is a piece of shit, as if Ricky Gervais, Ellen, and like half of Monty Python wasn't bad enough. Now a generation of people have to come to terms with the bigotry of one of their most beloved childhood icons, the woman who for decades stood as a pillar of liberal values, and the creator of a book series that helped so many of them come to terms with an often harsh, cruel world. Now as I've said, I mentioned in a previous video that I believe that not only is Rowling probably a TERF, but that creating a universe in which trans people can very easily and happily exist in much more comfort than in our world, and yet still maintain that not only do trans people not exist, but also imply that sex and gender are immutable and binary. It's both depressing and also absurd. Like, there's this bit in the Deathly Hallows where 6 people, including several women, all take a potion that turns them into Harry, perfectly anatomically, and she didn't bother to think about the wider connotations or implications of that. She didn't think, hey, maybe this might have practical applications outside of disguise. And furthermore, she created the plight of the Muggle-born wizards to almost perfectly replicate LGBTQ+ prejudice. Much like the X-Men, they're thrust into a new life, a new perspective and way of seeing the world, while simultaneously being looked down upon and shunned both by individuals within society at large and legislated against by the government. And all this only starts in early adolescence, the time when most LGBTQ+ people really start to discover and express themselves, though of course there are exceptions, and did nothing with that, instead shitting on her marginalised fans by queer-baiting and refusing to acknowledge the queerness of certain characters within the text.
You and Grindelwald were as close as brothers.
Oh, we were closer than brothers.
And also insisting that she's much more progressive than she actually is because she can invent marginalised identities for her characters on Twitter, and that's basically what progressivism is, right? So before we get into analysing her latest fucking shit tweet, I'm just going to drop the clip of me going over her previous transphobic shite into the video here. If you've already seen my video about the politics of Harry Potter, feel free to skip it. I'll put the timestamp on screen somewhere. If you haven't though, here's the context from which we in the J.K. Rowling is transphobic camp are operating.
Hey, did you know that J.K. Rowling is probably a TERF? Well, I've mentioned it a couple of times now, but I didn't either actually until I started noticing her Twitter activity, and then again when I started doing research in preparation for working on this video. Before we get into her online behaviour however, I want to just highlight this actual real snippet from one of her novels under the pseudonym of Robert Galbraith. If you go for that door one more fucking time, I'm calling the police. I'll testify and I'll be glad to watch you go down for attempted murder. And it won't be fun for you inside, Pippa, he added, not pre-op. Yikes. Let's talk about Twitter for a moment, shall we? Now, I have heard the argument that likes are not endorsements and follows are not endorsements, but I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that. However, as a result, I'm not saying that J.K. Rowling is definitely a TERF. However, I would say that these examples are rather incriminating. She liked this post from a fellow transphobe who in the past described trans women as men in dresses. This article, implying that trans women are just rapists pretending to be women in order to gain access to women's spaces, happily slapped a like on anti-trans articles and attacks my journalist again, arguing that trans women are just dangerous men out to rape women, saying no fox has the right to live in a hen house even if he identifies as a hen, conveniently leaving out the extremely well documented fact that trans women are significantly more likely to be the victims of sexual or violent assault than being the perpetrator of one, and accused a trans model of being a porn model based on essentially nothing, and has now started following Magdalene Burns, a transphobe so vile that the depths of her bigotry are actually impressive. She has, for example, in the past stated that trans women's Rowling's friends who accept them as a woman are just being polite, that no trans woman can ever pass, and that being trans is a delusional fantasy. And she's not the only one. Among Rowling's follow list is Graham Linehan and a number of other transphobes. She only follows 700 people, so it's not unrealistic to believe that this is not accidental. Rowling has denied all of this, of course, but do we believe her? That's the question, isn't it? I personally absolutely don't, but your mileage may vary. So what does this have to do with the text at hand? Well, it's interesting because Rowling has created ways for trans people to effectively not only transition from one gender to another, but effectively transform into whichever sex they prefer through the use of Polyjuice Potion, which literally completely transforms you into anyone you like, including someone of a different sex or gender. Plus, it's really not out of the realms of possibility that this can be done on a permanent basis with magic. Ron has his features fucked around within the Deathly Hallows, so is it that much of a stretch to make the case that maybe this could be done with genitals or secondary sex characteristics as well? There are definitely spells which cause rapid beard growth after all, which would be extremely helpful to trans men. Weird that we don't see many of these trans witches and wizards, but I can't decide if it's due to Rowling's vicious transphobia, a lazy erasure of minority groups, or convenience, or simply just another example of not wanting to reduce her audience of bigots.
So that's the context, but what actually happened now? Well, J.K. Rowling recently tweeted this. On the surface it seems pretty innocuous, harmless even. How could anyone disagree with something like this? In fact, it did fool quite a lot of liberal heroes like Mark Hamill, who later apologised after being informed that it was malicious garbage. Let's go through it point by point, shall we? Dress however you please. This is pretty obviously an allusion to the aforementioned assertion that all trans women are just confused cross-dressers, drag queens carrying out a performance of femininity but not actually achieving it, or as some TERFs have described it, the blackface or minstrel show of femininity. This is not a supportive message. Saying dress however you please is half a sentence, with the implied other half being it still doesn't make you a woman, or man, of course for trans men, but for some reason TERFs seem to exclusively focus on trans women, ignoring trans men altogether. Probably because they're inconvenient to their arguments. Likewise with the next sentence, call yourself whatever you like. It reiterates the message. You can say you're a woman, and almost all the scientific literature and or relevant research may agree with you, but I'm not going to respect your wishes or use your preferred pronouns. On the one hand, these first two sentences, even taken together, are pretty innocuous or even supportive of an individual's lifestyle choices, but the problem here is that based on Rowling's previous activity, as well as the context we'll get into in a moment, the implication is clear. Rowling believes that you should be able to dress however you like and change your name, but she will not respect your autonomy or validity as a trans person and certainly won't respect your pronouns. This next part is, for me, probably the most infuriating. Sleep with any consenting adult who will have you. There's so much toxicity, bigotry and bile poured into this one ostensibly innocent sentence that makes me really rather angry, but simultaneously impressed that someone can pull that off. I guess that's why she's the published author and I'm the loser making videos on the internet. Anyway, the concept of this just screams, I think, that transness is purely a sexual thing, which is clearly ridiculous. Like, I know a fucking ton of trans people who are either asexual or else celibate due to extreme dysphoria and or fear of what actively looking for intimacy might bring, and not without reason. Sexually active trans women often face massive dangers from toxically masculine men who enjoy the experience but will react to their attraction to a trans woman with violence against that trans woman, and who then often actually get off, incidentally, due to successfully using the gay panic defense. Chasers, who are often extremely dangerous individuals and see trans women as a fetish, not a person, who, again, are responsible for a huge amount of violence perpetrated against trans people. But yeah, J.K. Rowling apparently reckons people go through all that because they have a weird kink, I guess. Or how about the deliberate use of the phrase consenting adult? Yeah, once again parroting someone else she follows and apparently believes in, as well as perpetuating probably the most harmful lie and stereotype about trans people, and especially trans women, the fear of the trans rapist or even trans child molester. As I mentioned in my previous video, Rowling definitely associates with people who refer to trans women being in women's prisons as a fox in a hen house, which identifies as a hen, but this is not a new phenomenon. It dates back decades, some might even argue centuries. The idea, which is rather ironic coming from someone who claims to be a feminist, is that men are naturally predatory and inherently programmed to be sexual aggressors. So a lot of the time someone who claims to be a trans woman is likely to in fact be a predatory man, pretending to be a woman in order to enter female spaces. This is one of the oldest and most despicable stereotypes often peddled by bigots and, yes, mostly TERFs, to argue against any kind of development in trans rights whatsoever. After all, these aren't really women, and any development in this area at all is merely an agenda to to undermine and threaten women's rights by putting them in situations where disgusting sexual predators can enter their private spaces in order to molest them or something. Even though, I mean, there's not a biological lock on public toilets, JK. If I really wanted, I, a cis man, could go take a dump in the women's shithouse, and if I was intent on molesting someone whilst there, I don't think the law would stop me because, well, attacking women is already against the law, so if I was willing to commit a serious crime in the first place, why would the idea that I might also be committing a lesser crime stop me? But I think the worst part of this sentence is the "who'll have you" part, because it conveys a not particularly subtle implication that simply by nature of being trans women are in some way inherently undesirable, or that it's in some way abnormal or abhorrent for anyone to want to sleep with a trans woman. Again, echoing a previous tweet she interacted with claiming that trans women can never pass and so on. Basically, what she's saying here is that not only are trans women just people playing pretend, but also that people who desire or love trans people are desperate or have something wrong with them. Just look at this turn of phrase. Rowling doesn't say sleep with anyone you want, or sleep with someone who loves you, or anything like that. Sleep with any fucker who'll look at you and not be disgusted by your very existence, because let's be honest, beggars can't be choosers, and you're definitely in no position to be picky. Take whoever's desperate enough not to immediately reject you regardless of any real connection or attraction, and definitely endure any abusive tendencies, because hey, it's not like you can do any better. Oh, and try not to rape them. J.K. Rowling, progressive hero. The live your best life in peace and security shit is pure fucking hypocrisy. Trans people are getting murdered, beaten up, assaulted, raped, and having their legislative rights stripped away by neoliberal governments like the ones Rowling wants to rule the world, primarily because of the people like her and their dangerous, damaging influence, furthering harmful and hateful ideas about marginalised people and groups. Like it or not, a respected figure like J.K. Rowling, who's beloved of basically everyone under the age of 40 the world over, saying shit like this only serves to normalise this kind of rhetoric and attitude, and therefore cause less of an issue when someone with ideas like this goes and kills a trans woman. You can say, live your best life in peace and security, but let's be honest here, the reason many trans women aren't able to live in peace and security is because of people like Rowling and her poisonous rhetoric being shared to millions of people. Imagine this being used for any other demographic. Imagine a homophobe saying, live your best life in peace and security, to a gay man after they've done everything they can to oppress, reduce rights and demonise them. Imagine a racist or member of the KKK or something saying that to a black man. It's disingenuous at best and cowardly at worst. But let's be honest here, the smoking gun is the hashtags and the reframing of the case of Maya Forstater. Let's just take a look at that, shall we, to see what it was that got Rowling so upset. I'll be quoting extensively from articles covering the case here, mostly just because they were able to summarise it much more succinctly than I was when I tried. Maya Forstater was a researcher on business and international development at the international charitable think tank Centre for Global Development, which focuses on poverty and inequality, which is ironic, in London until her contract was not renewed earlier this year, following a dispute over tweets she sent opposing government proposals to reform the Gender Recognition Act that were labelled offensive and exclusionary. She asserted that having gender-critical views, a phrase often used to defend trans-exclusionary feminism, should be protected under equalities legislation, but the judge ruled that Forstater's views did not have the protected characteristics of philosophical belief and are incompatible with human dignity and fundamental rights of others. Protected characteristics, including that of holding philosophical beliefs, do not prevent people from having to take care not to harass others, the judgment said, adding that if a trans person has a gender recognition certificate, they are legally the gender they say they are, and that is not something that the claimant is entitled to ignore. Forstater said on her Crowd Justice page, where she raised over £80,000 for her legal fees, that she felt shock and disbelief at losing her case, which was held at a Central London Employment Tribunal. Women face discrimination on the basis of our sex, Forstater said. The rights of women to organise, to play a role in public life, and to be protected against discrimination have been hard won in recent generations. The judgment found that gender-critical views are not protected under the Equality Act 2010, noting that they are not worthy of respect in a democratic society and that they conflict with the fundamental human rights of others. Forstater is not entitled to ignore the legal rights of a person who has transitioned gender, the judgment said, noting the enormous pain that can be caused by misgendering a person. Judge James Taylor, an employment judge, said the claimant's position is that even if a trans woman has a gender recognition certificate, she cannot honestly describe herself as a woman. That belief is not worthy of respect in a democratic society. Taylor added, the claimant largely ignores intersex conditions and the fact that biological opinion is increasingly moving away from an absolutist approach. Many concerns that the claimant has, such as ensuring the protection of vulnerable women, do not, in fact, rest on holding a belief that biological sex is immutable. Maya Forstater said, this judgment removes women's rights and the right to freedom of belief and speech. But TERFs aren't right-wing, they just use all the same arguments and care deeply about the freedom of speech, especially when it relates to their right to bigotry. So just to make this perfectly clear. Maya Forstater was a TERF who was found to be repeatedly harassing trans women online, poorly representing and embarrassing her workplace, which, as I just mentioned, has a heavy focus on combating inequality by tweeting out transphobic bollocks. Incidentally, by her own count, it was approximately 150 transphobic tweets in the space of a single week, and then her employer didn't renew her contract. That part's important. They didn't fire her, didn't abuse her like she abused trans people or anything like that. They simply didn't renew her contract, which, I mean, if you're representing your employer, and she proudly displayed her employer in her bio as far as I'm aware, on Twitter by saying and doing transphobic shit, making colleagues feel uncomfortable with open transphobia at work, and then acting the victim when called out on it, well, you're not being oppressed here. Mind you, she was warned. She received a polite letter asking her to tone it down because she was making her co-workers uncomfortable, and had been called into meetings with management to discuss it, and she didn't at any point think, hey, maybe I shouldn't be quite so much of a dickhead in the office. So then she decided to sue her employer and claim that bigotry was covered under the Equality Act, which, as someone who had a lot of battles with employers over their responsibilities when it comes to, in my case, disability, under the Equality Act, well, I can tell you that bigotry is not a protected characteristic, but gender identity absolutely is. And that's why the bigots are upset now, including J.K. Rowling. A woman was a right dickhead to her co-workers, was outed as a bigot on Twitter, refused to take back or tone down any of her bigotry either online or in the office, and was so fucking stupid that she was doing all this while her contract was up for renewal. And also, TERFs, again including J.K. Rowling, have a lot of deep-seated hate and resentment towards a group of people about whom they seem to know very little beyond whatever shit they've either made up or cobbled together from bigoted stereotypes and or media representations.